Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight's story belongs to our events line, where history itself becomes the character, and the lessons are written not in one life, but in the lives of millions. In tonight's reflection, we revisit a moment when invisible threads of light began to bind us together. A time when the clunky sound of a dial-up modem was not just noise, but the whisper of a new age. This was the birth of the internet boom. But behind the success, the euphoria, and the dreams, there were also doubts, moral dilemmas, and unseen divine patterns. For with every invention that draws us closer, humanity must face the question, do we use this gift to heal or to harm? It did not begin with fireworks or fanfare. In fact, it began in silence, in the humming of servers, in the blinking of lonely terminals inside university basements. In the early 1990s, the internet was still a playground for scientists, engineers, and dreamers. Most of the world had never heard of it. A few who had dismissed it as a passing fad. But then something happened. Something that shifted the world forever. A young college student in Boston sent an email to a friend in Tokyo. A simple message, only a few lines long. But when that friend replied within seconds, across oceans, without stamps, without borders, without waiting weeks for a letter, the realization dawned, geography had just lost its power. Was this mere coincidence of technology? Or was it a sign that God had allowed humanity to taste a glimpse of true connection? In homes, the story was different. Many remember the sound, the shrill screech of a dial-up modem. Parents yelling, "Get off the phone!" as children tried to log on. But to those children, those sounds meant something profound. It meant stepping into a world larger than their town, their school, their country. One teenager in Ohio remembers logging into an early chat room. He typed, "Hello, is anyone there?" Seconds later, a reply appeared. "Yes. Greetings from Brazil." He froze. He had never met anyone from Brazil, never traveled beyond his state, and yet here, on a glowing screen in his bedroom, he felt the presence of another soul. He later said, "In that moment, I understood something my church had always taught me, that we are all children of God, connected not by wires, but by something deeper. The internet just reminded me of it." But for every story of wonder, there was a shadow. A mother in London spoke of how her son, once bright and lively, began spending endless hours online. At first, she thought it was harmless. Then his grades slipped, his friends stopped calling, and his eyes carried the weight of sleepless nights. "This gift," she said tearfully, "felt like a blessing at first, but I feared it was becoming a curse." And so a question arose. Was the internet God's gift to unite us, or a test to see how we would use it? As companies began to see the potential, the 1990s erupted with startups. Silicon Valley, once orchards and small workshops, now buzzed with young entrepreneurs fueled by pizza, caffeine, and dreams. Some created tools to make the world smaller. Search engines, email platforms, instant messengers. Others dreamed of money, and in that hunger, the seeds of greed were sown. One early investor later confessed, "We thought we were building a new Eden. But some of us were also building towers of Babel." Did they know then? Could they imagine how much this digital dawn would reshape families, nations, and the soul of humanity? The internet boom was not just about technology, it was about destiny. And destiny always carries with it both light and shadow. But before the bubble grew, before dot-com millionaires rose and fell, before billions carried smartphones in their pockets, there were smaller moments. Moments that proved God was already weaving something far greater than business. A doctor in rural Kenya remembers it well. He had a single computer, gifted by a foreign aid group. For the first time, he could email doctors in Europe for advice on treating rare diseases. One child lived because of that connection. "I realized then," he said, "that the internet was not made by man alone. It was guided by something higher." As the fire spread first in whispers, then in roaring headlines, the world began to change. Some feared it, some resisted it, some embraced it too quickly, but all felt it. The ground beneath humanity's feet had shifted. And here lies the mystery. Was it simply science, the product of cables and codes? Or was it divine timing, God's reminder that humanity was meant to connect, that isolation was never his plan? What came next would reveal not just the brilliance of human invention, but the fragility of human ambition. And soon, the internet would not only connect us, it would test us. The internet had begun as a whisper between scientists and students, but by the mid-1990s, it was becoming a roar. Yet for every person who saw it as a miracle, there were others who treated it as a passing novelty. One journalist in New York remembered his editor scoffing, "The internet is like CB radio, a fad. People will get bored and move on." But that same year, a bookstore nobody had heard of, called Amazon, launched from a garage in Seattle. A young man named Jeff Bezos packed books himself, sealing them with tape late at night. He was not just selling books, he was introducing a new way of life. Was it coincidence that his timing aligned with the great digital awakening? Or was it destiny? Across the ocean in a modest apartment in Estonia, 3 programmers sat huddled around aging computers. Their dream was simple: to make international calling cheaper. What they created instead was Skype, a platform that would shrink the world so completely that a grandmother in Cairo could see her granddaughter's first steps in London. One of the founders later said, "We were not thinking about history. We were just trying to solve a problem. But God sometimes takes small problems and uses them to change the course of humanity." But the internet was not only about business, it was about connection. And in that connection, humanity was learning new lessons. Take the story of Anna, a school teacher in Manila. She had never traveled abroad, but one evening, she entered a teacher's forum online. There she found colleagues from Canada, Nigeria, and Italy. Together, they shared lesson plans, advice, even prayers for struggling students. Anna said, "I realized then that my classroom was no longer 4 walls. It was as wide as the earth itself." For Anna, the internet was not a machine. It was a ministry. And yet, shadows grew. In Los Angeles, a father told of how his teenage daughter began chatting online with strangers. At first, he thought nothing of it. But when one of those strangers persuaded her to sneak out and meet, his heart nearly stopped. She was found safe, but shaken. That night, he prayed, "Lord, why give us this power if it can also be used to hurt?" It was the eternal question. Every gift carries a risk. Fire can warm a family or burn down a city. The internet was no different. Do we always recognize when a blessing comes with a warning? Meanwhile, in boardrooms, fortunes were rising overnight. Investors poured millions into .com startups, some with no real product at all. A website with only a catchy name could raise millions in days. Young entrepreneurs drove sports cars, declared themselves visionaries, and built glass towers in Silicon Valley. But behind the glitter was arrogance. Many believed the internet was theirs to control. They forgot that history always humbles the proud, and in the late 1990s, the first cracks began to show. One man in Texas recalled putting his entire savings into an online pet supply company, convinced it would make him rich. For months, the stock price soared. He boasted to his neighbors that he was part of a new golden age. But within a year, the company collapsed. His savings were gone. He stood in his driveway weeping, whispering, "Was this a dream or a curse?" The .com bubble was inflating fast, and God's eternal law, that pride comes before the fall, was about to be written in neon across Wall Street. But amid the frenzy, miracles quietly bloomed. In Sarajevo, still scarred by war, a group of young people connected to the world for the first time through a donated satellite link. They wrote poems, shared stories, and told the world what it meant to rebuild a city from ashes. One survivor wrote, "The bombs silenced us, but the internet gave us our voice back." It was not the corporations or the investors who felt the true weight of the internet. It was the ordinary souls who discovered they were no longer invisible. By 1999, the internet had gone from whisper to wildfire. Cafes with rows of glowing monitors appeared in every city. Strangers sat side by side, staring at screens, their fingers typing furiously. They were not just sending messages, they were crossing invisible bridges. And with every message, every click, a larger question burned beneath it all. Was this humanity's invention? Or was it heaven's reminder that we were always meant to be connected? By the late 1990s, the internet was no longer a secret. It was a gold rush. Investors who once ignored it now begged for a piece. Newspapers that once mocked it filled their front pages with headlines like, "The future is online." Wall Street had discovered cyberspace, and in its greed, it believed it had discovered eternity. Young men in hoodies were hailed as prophets. Companies with little more than a logo and a dream were valued at billions. And for a moment, it seemed like the laws of economics no longer applied. But God's laws always apply. Pride still came before the fall. One venture capitalist remembered walking into a pitch meeting where three young founders showed him nothing more than a website that promised to sell groceries online. They had no warehouses, no trucks, not even a full business plan. And yet, within minutes, investors pledged millions. It was madness, he later admitted. We were drunk on dreams. But beneath that madness, there was something deeper. A human desire for connection, for convenience, for progress. Could it be that the internet had awakened not just greed, but also the yearning for a better life? Take the story of Linda, a single mother in Chicago. She worked long hours, and raising her two children alone left her exhausted. One day, she discovered she could order groceries from her computer. It felt like a miracle, she said. I didn't have to drag my kids across town. I could spend that time reading them a bedtime story instead. To Linda, the internet wasn't a bubble or a fad. It was God's mercy disguised as technology. But for every Linda, there was a James. James was a warehouse worker in Atlanta. When the company he worked for was bought by a dot-com startup, the new owners promised him stock options worth more than gold. He believed them. He quit his second job, dreaming of early retirement. But when the bubble burst, his shares were worthless. He lost his home. He lost his faith. I thought God had abandoned me, he said quietly years later. But had God abandoned him? Or had humanity abandoned wisdom? In March 2000, the bubble finally burst. Billions of dollars evaporated in days. The same newspapers that had sung praises now shouted doomsday. Analysts declared the internet dead, but the internet was not dead. It was simply shedding the illusions wrapped around it. The greed, the pride, the false promises, they collapsed. What remained was the core, the undeniable truth that connection was here to stay. Sometimes God allows illusions to crumble so truth can shine brighter. Consider the story of Raj, a student in Mumbai. He had taught himself coding in a tiny internet cafe, often skipping meals to afford a single hour online. When the bubble burst, many in the West despaired, but Raj saw opportunity. With cheaper technology flooding the market, he bought an old computer and began building software for local businesses. Years later, his company employed hundreds. He said, when the bubble burst, they called it destruction. For me, it was creation. Perhaps that is how God works. He clears the false so the real can grow. Meanwhile, in Africa, missionaries celebrated a different kind of boom. With falling costs, small villages gained access to satellite internet. For the first time, schools could download books, pastors could share sermons, and doctors could consult experts across the globe. One missionary wrote, "I came here to give, but I ended up receiving." The internet taught me that God's love is borderless, just like his mercy. The crash humbled Wall Street, but it did not stop the march of destiny. For in the ashes of broken startups, the seeds of giants were already taking root. Google, Facebook, YouTube. Each would reshape not only economies, but the way souls saw themselves. But before those giants rose, humanity faced a choice. Would the internet be a tool for vanity or a vessel for meaning? The answer was still unwritten. And in bedrooms, classrooms, and churches, ordinary people began writing it with their lives. The crash had silenced the roar of the late 1990s, but from the silence came clarity. The internet was not dead. It was only being reborn. In the early 2000s, something profound emerged. Search engines. For centuries, knowledge had been locked away, inside libraries, universities, and the hands of the privileged. But now, with a single keystroke, anyone could ask a question and receive an answer. One young man in Cairo recalled typing, "How do I fix a broken bicycle chain?" In seconds, instructions appeared. He laughed in disbelief. "I felt like I had the world's wisdom in my pocket." It was more than information. It was empowerment. But could humanity handle such power without losing humility? The rise of Google was not just a business story. It was a spiritual story. Its mission, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible, sounded almost biblical. Imagine a tool that sought to place all human knowledge in one place. But knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. A teacher in Mexico noticed her students began quoting answers directly from the internet without thinking critically. They thought knowing was the same as understanding, she said. And so, the internet offered a divine test. Would people seek wisdom or only shortcuts? At the same time, email became the bloodstream of society. Businesses ran on it, families reunited through it, and governments feared it. A soldier stationed in Afghanistan remembered the day he received an email from his daughter back home. "I miss you, Daddy. Come home soon." He read it again and again, tears staining the dusty keyboard. "Without the internet," he said, "I might have lost the strength to keep going." The power of a few typed words was proof. Technology could carry love across oceans. But love, like knowledge, could also be twisted. The first online scams appeared. Emails claiming fortune, friendship, or romance. Some fell victim, losing money, trust, and even dignity. One elderly woman in Toronto confessed, "I thought God had finally answered my prayers for companionship." Instead, it was a thief. The question burned. Was the internet a divine rope pulling us together, or a net that could entangle the vulnerable? And then came something entirely new: online communities. In forums, message boards, and early social networks, people discovered they could gather without walls. Strangers became friends. Ideas became movements. In Seoul, a young musician uploaded his songs to an online platform. He had no record deal, no studio, no connections, but thousands listened, shared, and encouraged him. Years later, he stood on a world stage saying, "Without the internet, I would have been invisible. With it, God gave me a voice." Yet shadows lingered. In rural America, a pastor noticed many of his congregants now spent more time on their computers than in church pews. He worried, what happens when virtual fellowship replaces real fellowship? Could the internet deepen faith or dilute it? Meanwhile, hidden within dorm rooms and garages, new seeds were sprouting. A Harvard student named Mark Zuckerberg launched a small project called Facebook. Two friends in California founded YouTube, giving ordinary people a platform to broadcast their lives. To some, these looked like toys, but God often works through what seems small. From those seeds grew forests that would reshape culture, politics, and even identity itself. But in the early 2000s, no one could predict how large those shadows and lights would become. What was clear was this: the internet was no longer a fad. It had survived collapse, humbled the proud, and revealed both the beauty and brokenness of humanity. And as families gathered around screens, as businesses rebuilt, as churches live-streamed prayers for the first time, a whisper seemed to echo through it all. You are connected not by chance, but by design. What will you do with this gift? The story of the internet boom was no longer about wires or servers. It was about people. Millions of people whose choices would shape the soul of the digital age. And as the 2000s marched on, those choices would lead to breathtaking triumphs and chilling consequences. By the mid-2000s, the internet was no longer just a tool. It was becoming a mirror, reflecting humanity back to itself. And in that reflection, people saw not only progress, but also temptation. It began with the rise of platforms that gave ordinary people extraordinary voices. Wikipedia was one of the first, an encyclopedia that anyone could edit. For centuries, knowledge had been guarded by scholars and publishers. But now a teenager in Argentina could write about history, and his words could reach a professor in London. One scholar scoffed, "This will never work. Truth cannot be trusted to the masses." Yet to the world's surprise, it did work. Millions contributed, errors were corrected, and a living book grew before everyone's eyes. Was this chaos, or a reflection of God's design, that wisdom should not be locked away but shared freely among his children? And then came YouTube. At first, it was a simple site where people uploaded funny clips, music, or random thoughts. Few took it seriously. But within months, it became something more. A stage where voices long silenced could finally be heard. One pastor in Lagos uploaded a sermon recorded with a shaky camera. He expected only a handful of his congregation to watch. Instead, thousands across continents tuned in. For the first time, he said, I preached to the world. A teenager in California uploaded a video of herself singing in her bedroom. Weeks later, she was offered a record deal. She confessed, I thought nobody cared about me. But God used this platform to show me I was not invisible. The stage of the internet had no walls, no gates, no guards. It was both a blessing and a challenge. At Harvard, Facebook spread from one dorm to another, then across universities and soon across the globe. People discovered they could reconnect with childhood friends, share family photos, even announce engagements. For many, it felt like a dream. A mother in Spain said, I thought I had lost my best friend from childhood. 20 years later, I found her online. I cried that day. It felt like God had given me a second chance. But others found a different reality. A young man in Tokyo scrolled endlessly through photos of friends traveling, smiling, succeeding. He compared himself to them until he felt worthless. It made me feel small, he whispered. Connection brought joy, but it also stirred envy. Was the internet drawing people closer to truth, or trapping them in illusions? And yet, miracles unfolded. During the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, families separated by disaster found each other again through online message boards. One survivor wrote on a forum, looking for my sister, age 12, last seen on the beach. 2 days later, someone replied, she is safe. She is with a church group in Colombo. In the midst of tragedy, the internet became a lifeline, carrying hope faster than any rescue team could. But shadows grew too. The rise of online forums gave space for communities of hatred, crime, and despair. Isolated individuals who once suffered alone now found each other, and sometimes used that bond for destruction. A police officer in London recalled investigating his first case of online radicalization. He shook his head. It amazed me. A boy in a small town could be recruited into darkness without ever leaving his room. The internet was a sword, capable of cutting bonds of isolation, but also capable of wounding. And in the middle of this paradox, one truth remained clear. Humanity had stepped into a new era. Fame was no longer reserved for kings and movie stars. Truth was no longer held only by scholars. Connection was no longer bound by wires alone. With a single click, lives were changed. A song uploaded, a video shared, a post written. Each had the power to ripple across the globe. But was this newfound power making humanity wiser, or simply louder? The mid-2000s were proof of a divine paradox. Every gift comes with a question. And the internet was asking humanity the greatest question of all. Will you use this connection to build bridges, or to burn them? By the late 2000s, the internet had already survived its first collapse, humbled its doubters, and given rise to new giants. But what came next would change not only how people worked, but how they lived, loved, and even prayed. The smartphone arrived. Until then, the internet had been something you visited. You sat at a desk, dialed in, logged on, and then disconnected. But with the rise of devices like the iPhone, the internet no longer lived in homes or offices, it lived in pockets. A young father in Toronto remembered the first time he used his phone to video call his wife while traveling. He held up the device, and there she was, smiling with their newborn in her arms. I cried, he said, because I felt like I was there, even though I was miles away. For me, that was God's kindness in a piece of glass. But there was another father in Manila who watched his teenage son retreat further and further into a glowing screen. He was at the dinner table, the father said, but he was not with us. His eyes were always somewhere else. The smartphone was a miracle, but also a mirror. It showed humanity, both its longing for connection and its struggle with distraction. Could it be that God had given humanity a rope to climb closer together, but many were using it to drift further apart? Social media had begun as a playful tool, but by the early 2000s, it became the heartbeat of society. Movements rose from hashtags. Revolutions were streamed live. A woman in Cairo remembered standing in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring, phone in hand. "We told the world our story," she said, "and the world heard us." Her testimony was echoed in countless places. Voices once silenced by fear found strength in connection. But alongside it, envy, loneliness, and comparison grew louder. A teenager in London confessed, "Every scroll felt like a reminder that I was not enough. Everyone else seemed happier, richer, prettier. I forgot to thank God for my own life." The same platforms that spread hope also sowed despair. In the United States, a pastor reflected on live streaming his sermons for the first time. At first, he feared the sacred would be diluted by the digital. But then, during one late-night broadcast, a message appeared from a viewer in Brazil. "Your words saved me tonight. I was about to end my life, but I stumbled upon your stream." The pastor wept. "I realized," he said, "that the internet could be a pulpit God himself had built." But shadows continued. The same tools that spread truth also spread lies. Misinformation traveled faster than correction. A single false rumor could circle the world before the truth had a chance to breathe. One journalist sighed. "We used to ask, what is true? Now we ask, what is trending?" And in that question lay a moral dilemma. Was humanity still seeking truth or just comfort? Yet even in the noise, miracles bloomed. A child in rural India with no money for books discovered free online lectures. Years later, he became a doctor. He said, "My teachers lived thousands of miles away, but God brought them to me through a screen." For him, the internet was not distraction. It was salvation. By the early 2000s, the world had changed beyond recognition. Businesses no longer asked if they should be online, they asked how. Families no longer wrote letters, they sent emojis. Prayers no longer stayed within church walls, they were shared, retweeted, and echoed across continents. The internet was no longer an invention, it was a new environment, a place where humanity now lived as much as breathed. But within this new world was a question more pressing than ever. Had humanity learned to master this gift? Or had the gift begun to master humanity? The answer was not yet clear. For every story of joy, there was one of sorrow. For every reunion, there was an addiction. For every miracle, there was a deception. The internet boom had connected humanity, but connection alone was not enough. What mattered was what people chose to do with it. And in the years to come, those choices would lead to triumphs, betrayals, and revelations that would test the very soul of the modern age. By the mid-2000s, the internet was no longer just a tool or even a place. It had become a stage where anyone could stand beneath the lights of the world and where applause or scorn could arrive in seconds. Fame had changed forever. Once, it took years of training, gatekeepers, and fortune to be seen. Now, a single viral video could turn a teenager into a household name overnight. One young woman in South Korea posted herself dancing in her bedroom. Within weeks, her moves were imitated by millions. Her name chanted in stadiums, her face recognized across oceans. She whispered in shock, "It felt like God had lifted me from obscurity into the spotlight." But just as quickly, others were torn down. A boy in Texas uploaded a clumsy joke. It spread not in admiration, but in ridicule. Overnight, he became a meme, mocked by strangers worldwide. He later confessed, "I didn't know a screen could carry so much cruelty." The internet gave voice to the voiceless, but it also gave a whip to the merciless. Influencers became a new kind of celebrity. They were not movie stars or athletes, but ordinary people who built audiences by sharing their lives online. Some used it to inspire, teaching fitness, faith, or kindness. Others used it to flaunt wealth, stir envy, or sell illusions. A woman in Brazil recalled following a glamorous influencer who seemed to live in endless luxury. "I felt so small," she admitted. "I thought my life was meaningless compared to hers." But months later, the influencer confessed that much of her lifestyle was staged, funded by debt and despair. The illusion crumbled, but the lesson remained. The internet had blurred the line between truth and performance. In this new age, truth itself became fragile. Political campaigns, businesses, even ordinary arguments played out online. A single post could divide families, topple reputations, or ignite protests. What once required armies or printing presses now required only a keyboard. One historian reflected, "In the past, truth was hidden by lack of access. Now, truth is hidden by too much noise." And perhaps that was the divine challenge of the internet age. Could humanity still recognize truth when it was drowned in endless echoes? Yet, amid the confusion, light still broke through. In Syria during the civil war, a young man uploaded videos documenting his city's suffering. His words reached millions, who sent aid and prayers. "I thought the world had forgotten us," he said. "But God used the internet to remind me we were not alone." In the Philippines, a group of volunteers created an online network to track missing children. Within months, several families were reunited. A mother held her child and wept. This was more than technology. This was mercy, but shadows deepened too. Cyberbullying, addiction, and depression spread. Mental health crises rose among teenagers who lived in constant comparison. Some parents called the internet a blessing. Others called it a curse. One father asked, "What kind of world are we giving our children? A world of connection or a world of illusion?" The internet had become both church and coliseum, where people prayed and played, healed and hurt, built and destroyed. By the end of the 2010s, one truth had become clear. The internet was no longer separate from life. It was life. Work, school, friendships, politics, entertainment, even faith. All were intertwined with the digital. And with this realization came a question that echoed louder than ever. Was humanity shaping the internet? Or was the internet shaping humanity? The answer, perhaps, was both. But beyond algorithms, beyond screens, beyond viral fame and digital shadows, one quiet whisper remained. You are connected not by wires, but by design. Do not forget who first made you one family. By the late 2000s, the internet was no longer a background tool. It was the stage on which the world performed its daily life. Streaming became the new cathedral of culture. Families once gathered around television sets at fixed times. Now, they streamed what they wanted, when they wanted. Movies, music, sermons, even funerals, all lived online. A grandmother in Argentina remembered watching her grandson's wedding through a live stream. She could not travel. Her health was failing. But there on her screen, she saw him say his vows. "It felt like God had carried me there, without moving my body," she said, tears filling her eyes. For her, streaming was not entertainment, it was a miracle. But for others, it was a burden. A teenager in Germany admitted he watched videos until dawn, unable to stop. "I wasn't living my own life," he said. "I was living through other people's screens." And so, as streaming empowered, it also enslaved. Was this tool shaping gratitude or addiction? Then came a darker storm, misinformation. In the age of endless posts and instant news, truth became contested. One false rumor could spread across continents in hours, leaving chaos in its wake. A nurse in Italy remembered fighting not just disease during a flu outbreak, but also lies. Patients refused treatments because of something they read online. She sighed. It was harder to fight words than sickness. And yet, wasn't this the oldest battle of all? Humanity had always struggled to tell truth from lie. The internet had only given the struggle a louder microphone. And then in 2020 came the ultimate test. A virus spread across the world, closing borders, schools, churches, and streets. Humanity locked itself indoors. But while doors closed, screens opened wider than ever before. The internet became lifeline. Children attended school online, learning from teachers who smiled through webcams. Businesses shifted meetings to virtual rooms. Families prayed together over video calls. A priest in New York whispered, "My church was empty, but my congregation was larger than ever." God's word traveled through wires when walls were shut. Yet, the same internet that carried comfort also carried fear. Rumors about the virus, conspiracies, and anger flooded platforms. People grew divided, even while they were united in isolation. One woman in Brazil confessed, "I didn't know what to believe anymore." Every post contradicted the last. I lost trust, not just in the internet, but in people. The internet had become both medicine and poison, but miracles still emerged. A musician in Italy, locked in his apartment, began playing his violin on his balcony. Someone recorded it and uploaded the video. Within days, millions around the world listened, crying together in their homes. "I only wanted to comfort my neighbors," he said, "but God carried my song farther than I ever dreamed." Connection had become survival. By the early 2020s, the internet was no longer just technology. It was the bloodstream of humanity. It carried joy and pain, lies and truth, fear and faith. It united and divided, healed and wounded. And yet beneath it all, one divine pattern seemed undeniable. Humanity was not meant to be alone. The internet, for all its flaws, was proof of that truth. But would humanity remember to use this gift as God intended, to lift one another? Or would it continue to fall into shadows of pride, envy, and deceit? The years ahead would hold the answer. By the 2020s, the internet was no longer new, no longer experimental. It was the air humanity breathed. And in that air, entire worlds rose and fell. Work itself changed. In past generations, people commuted through traffic, clocked in at factories or offices, and shook hands across polished tables. Now, meetings were pixels on a screen. Resumes became LinkedIn profiles. Interviews were video calls. A mother in India whispered a prayer of thanks as she tucked her children into bed after finishing her shift for an American company, all from her laptop. "I never thought I could provide for my family without leaving them," she said. "God gave me work that kept me home." But another father in Chicago admitted, "The lines blurred. I was working at home, but I was never really home. My children saw my face every day, but not my attention." The internet had given freedom, but also blurred the borders of life. Was this liberation or a new form of captivity? Family bonds, too, were reshaped. Grandparents who once waited for postcards now joined birthday parties through video calls. Siblings separated by oceans laughed together online as if they were in the same room. A soldier in Syria watched the birth of his daughter through a live stream. He cried, "I wasn't there, but I was there. God still let me witness it." Yet, some families fractured. At dinner tables, children's faces glowed with screens instead of candles. Parents scrolled through endless feeds while their toddlers tugged at their sleeves. One mother in Paris confessed, "I feared my children would remember my phone more than my face." The internet connected families across continents, but sometimes it disconnected those across the same table. Faith also found new ground. In the pandemic years, prayers streamed from empty churches, mosques, and synagogues. Congregations logged in from bedrooms, kitchens, and hospital wards. A woman battling cancer in London said, "I couldn't leave my bed, but God's word still reached me through a screen." At the same time, others worried about the dilution of sacredness. Could digital worship carry the same weight as kneeling together in a holy place? Could connection replace communion? Perhaps this was the eternal question. Was the internet meant to be a substitute for the sacred, or a bridge to it? And then came the stories hidden in plain sight, the quiet miracles of generosity. In Manila, a young man lost his job. Desperate, he posted his story on a forum, asking only for advice. To his astonishment, strangers pooled together donations that carried his family through months of rent and food. I prayed for help, he said, and God answered me through people I had never met. In the United States, a woman who could not afford surgery received an anonymous online donation. The message read simply, "You don't know me, but God knows you." The internet, so often criticized for greed and pride, had also become a vessel for compassion. But even in generosity, moral dilemmas lurked. Was it right that people relied on strangers for survival, while governments and neighbors sometimes turned away? Did the internet inspire true charity, or had it replaced the personal touch of knocking on a neighbor's door? One pastor asked his congregation, "Is giving online less holy than giving in person? Or is the holiness not in the method, but in the heart?" By the 2020s, the internet had blurred every boundary between work and home, family and distance, truth and lies, sacred and ordinary. It was no longer simply an invention. It was a mirror of the human soul. And in that mirror, the same eternal truth could be seen, that humanity, no matter how divided by nations, languages, or creeds, was connected by something far greater than fiber optic cables. But would people remember the divine thread woven beneath the digital one? The story of the internet boom was not over. In fact, its greatest tests and its deepest blessings were still unfolding. By the 2020s, the internet was more than a network. It was a second skin wrapped around humanity. But with that skin came scars. Privacy became the first price. Once, secrets belonged to diaries and locked drawers. Now, they were scattered across platforms and servers, often without people realizing. A young woman in Poland discovered that photos she posted years ago resurfaced during a job interview. She whispered in shame, "I thought the internet forgot." But it never forgets. A cybersecurity expert in New York admitted, "We built a world where every click leaves a footprint." The question is not whether God sees us, he always has, but whether we realize how much man now does. The internet gave humanity a new kind of memory, endless, merciless, permanent. Identity blurred next. In earlier generations, people introduced themselves with family names, jobs, or hometowns. Online, they could reinvent themselves with a username, a profile picture, an avatar. Some used this freedom to express hidden talents. Others used it to hide sins. A teenager in Canada confessed, "Online, I was confident, funny, even beautiful. Offline, I felt invisible. I lived more as my screen self than as my real self." The digital mask could liberate or imprison. Was it a chance to explore God's gifts, or a temptation to escape His truth? Mental health trembled. Endless scrolling, curated perfection, and algorithm-driven envy gnawed at hearts. Psychologists called it the loneliness of the connected. One college student in Seoul admitted, "I had thousands of followers. But when I turned off my phone, the silence was unbearable." Yet, the same internet also saved lives. A man in Nigeria, sinking into depression, stumbled into an online prayer group. Strangers prayed for him daily, lifting him when he could not lift himself. "I thought I was alone," he said, "but God found me through them." Amid shadows, creativity blossomed. Artists once rejected by galleries now sold their paintings online. Musicians without record labels found global audiences. Writers who feared rejection posted stories that inspired millions. One poet in Cairo said, "I prayed that my words would matter." And then, one night, someone from Chile wrote to me, saying my poem saved her from despair. That was my answer. The internet became not only a marketplace, but a canvas, a place where God's gift of creativity could ripple across oceans. Resilience, too, found new forms. During natural disasters, online communities raised funds within hours, often faster than governments could respond. When wildfires raged in California, strangers sent help to families they had never met. A father who lost his home said, "When I prayed for deliverance, I never imagined it would arrive through PayPal. The internet had blurred borders, not just of nations, but of compassion. And in the midst of all this, privacy lost, identity blurred, minds shaken, hearts lifted, one truth whispered louder than the rest. The internet was never simply about technology. It was about what humanity chose to reveal about itself. Its generosity, its greed, its loneliness, its longing for God. Perhaps that was always the divine design, to give humanity a tool so vast, so powerful, that it forced people to ask not, what can we do? But who are we becoming? The answer to that question was still unfolding, for with every click, every share, every search, humanity was not just building the internet, it was writing its own soul across the wires. By the mid-2020s, the internet was no longer just a tool of commerce or culture. It had become the arena where morality itself was contested. Politics entered the digital battlefield. Campaigns that once relied on door-to-door visits or town halls now fought wars of influence online. One strategist admitted, "We no longer persuade with speeches. We persuade with algorithms." But this power came at a cost. A false story could sway millions before the truth could catch its breath. Trust in institutions eroded. Families argued at dinner tables, parroting posts instead of listening to each other. A grandmother in Ohio sighed, "I raised my children to think for themselves." Now, they just repeat what they read online. It feels like the internet is raising them instead of me. The question burned. Was this progress? Or was it the Tower of Babel rebuilt in pixels? Morality itself blurred. What once required courage to say in public could now be whispered online in anonymity. Some used that freedom to speak truth. Others used it to spew cruelty. A boy in France created a fake account to torment his classmate. Years later, he confessed in shame, "I thought it was harmless." But when she left school because of it, I realized I had sinned behind a mask. The internet had not created cruelty. It had only revealed it faster, louder, and more often. But even in this darkness, redemption flickered. A young woman in Mexico shared her story online. She had lived years in secret addiction, hiding her pain behind cheerful photos. One night she posted her confession in despair. Strangers flooded her inbox with encouragement, prayers, and resources. That night, she said, God used people I had never met to carry me out of the shadows. The same wires that carried gossip also carried grace. Faith, too, found a new home in the digital age. A Muslim scholar in Indonesia live-streamed his lectures, reaching millions who could never travel to study in person. A Christian pastor in Africa built an online Bible study group that spanned 20 countries. A rabbi in New York answered questions from seekers around the globe. One seeker in Berlin confessed, "I did not step into a mosque or a church to find God. I opened my browser, and there, in the words of strangers, I found my way back to Him." Was this proof that God could use even man's inventions to draw souls closer to Him? Or was it a warning that people risked confusing the tool with the source? Second chances unfolded in hidden corners. A prisoner in Texas, allowed limited online access, discovered faith forums. He began reading daily, writing prayers, and connecting with people who saw him not as a criminal, but as a child of God. When released, he said, "The internet gave me the only friends who believed I could change. Without them, I might have returned to the darkness." A widow in South Korea, lost in grief, stumbled onto an online community for mourners. There, she found others who spoke her pain. Slowly, she healed. "I thought God had abandoned me," she said. But through their words, He whispered that He was still here. The internet had revealed humanity's ugliest sins: pride, greed, envy, cruelty. But it had also revealed God's fingerprints: mercy, forgiveness, unexpected compassion. Perhaps that was the ultimate paradox. The internet was neither holy nor wicked. It was the stage upon which both heaven and hell revealed their players. And in that tension lay the eternal question: would humanity choose to use this global gift to glorify itself, or to glorify the one who made connection possible in the first place. The story was not finished. The internet boom was still unfolding, still asking, still testing. And somewhere in its vastness, unseen hands were still at work, guiding threads of mercy through the web of wires. For centuries, memory had been fragile. Libraries burned, scrolls decayed, photographs faded. But now, with servers humming across continents, every word, every image, every mistake and miracle could be preserved. Sometimes, forever. A professor in Germany reflected, "For the first time in history, ordinary lives are recorded in detail. Birthdays, meals, conversations, even prayers, captured not in stone, but in code." It was as though humanity had built its own book of remembrance. But unlike God's perfect record, this one was flawed, sometimes cruel, sometimes unforgiving. The blessing of memory was clear. A grandmother in Kenya wept as she rewatched a video of her late husband singing. She whispered, "Without the internet, his voice would have vanished." Now I can still hear him. Families digitized old photos, preserving their heritage. Survivors of war uploaded testimonies, ensuring their suffering would not be erased by denial. Students in remote villages accessed centuries of literature once locked away in elite universities. For many, the internet's memory was a gift, a reminder that no life was too small to be remembered. But the curse was clear too. A young man in Canada applied for a job, only to be rejected because of a foolish post he made as a teenager. He groaned, "I changed!" But the internet refused to forgive me. In earlier times, sins could be repented, reputations rebuilt, pasts buried by mercy. Online mistakes lingered like ghosts. Screenshots outlived apologies. Search engines resurrected shame with a single click. The internet remembered, but it did not redeem. And here, perhaps, lay the divine lesson. God's record, too, is eternal. But unlike the internet, his memory is balanced with mercy. The Quran speaks of a book in which all deeds are written. The Bible tells of names recorded in the book of life. In faith, remembrance is not only about justice, but also about forgiveness. A pastor in Nigeria reflected, "The internet can expose your sins, but only God can erase them." That was the difference. Humanity had built a system of eternal memory, but without eternal grace. This permanence reshaped society. Governments debated the right to be forgotten. Courts ruled on whether people could delete their pasts. Tech companies wrestled with responsibility. Should everything be preserved? Or should mercy exist even in memory? One activist asked, "If God forgives, why can't the internet?" But perhaps the internet's harshness served as a reminder that humanity needs more than memory. It needs redemption. Yet, blessings continued. A child in Lebanon listened to the archived voice of his father, killed in conflict, reading bedtime stories. He clutched the phone, whispering, "It feels like he is still here." A woman in Peru uploaded her grandmother's recipes, ensuring they lived beyond her lifetime. "It is a kind of immortality," she said. And in those small acts, people touched eternity, glimpses of what God had already promised, that nothing, no good deed, is ever truly lost. The internet as memory was both warning and wonder. It showed humanity the power of permanence without forgiveness, and in doing so, it pointed back to the one whose memory is perfect, but whose mercy is greater still. Perhaps that was always the lesson, to remind us that eternity without grace is unbearable. By the 2020s, the internet had become more than a memory. It had become a marketplace of souls. Once, markets were physical, bustling bazaars, town squares, trading posts. Now, commerce flowed invisibly across screens and servers. Anything could be bought: shoes, books, homes, even influence. A farmer in Nigeria sold crops directly to customers through an app. A seamstress in Vietnam shipped her handmade dresses to Europe without ever leaving her village. Both whispered prayers of gratitude. "God gave us wings through the internet," the seamstress said. But for every blessing, there was a shadow. A teenager in Los Angeles scrolled through targeted ads that seemed to know her secrets. She whispered uneasily, "How does it know what I'm thinking?" The truth was unsettling. People were no longer just consumers. They had become products. Their clicks, preferences, and even fears were harvested and sold. Connection had turned into currency. Influence itself became a commodity. Where kings once commanded crowds, now influencers commanded followers. Companies paid fortunes for a single post. Politicians measured power not in votes alone, but in likes and shares. A young man in Dubai admitted, "I prayed more for views than for God's approval." He confessed he felt chained, not freed, by the fame he built online. The internet had blurred devotion. Was influence a gift to inspire others, or an idol demanding endless sacrifice? And then came the trade of identity. Passwords stolen, data leaked, digital selves hijacked. A father in Brazil woke one morning to find his bank account drained by criminals who had stolen his online identity. His voice broke. It felt like my very self had been taken. The danger was clear. When connection became currency, identity itself was no longer sacred. It was negotiable. Yet, even in this marketplace, mercy surfaced. A widow in the Philippines ran a small bakery. Struggling after her husband's death, she turned to social media to advertise. Strangers began supporting her, posting reviews, sharing her story. Soon, her bakery thrived. She wept. "I thought I had lost everything, but God sent me customers I never met, who became family." For her, commerce was not corruption. It was compassion in disguise. But others fell prey to greed. Scammers exploited desperation. Children were trafficked through hidden networks. Addictions to shopping spiraled families into debt. The internet's marketplace became both cathedral and casino. A social worker in London asked, "How can one tool feed the hungry in one place and exploit the weak in another?" The answer perhaps was that the internet was only a reflection. It amplified what was already in human hearts: greed and generosity, selfishness and sacrifice. The moral dilemma grew sharper. Should technology companies profit from people's desires, even when those desires led to harm? Should governments regulate, even at the cost of freedom? Should individuals resist or embrace the endless trade of data and dreams? These were not merely economic questions, they were spiritual ones. One pastor asked his congregation, "If the internet is a marketplace, are we buyers, sellers, or souls being traded?" The silence in the room said more than words, and yet amid the chaos of commerce, one truth flickered. For every scam, there was generosity. For every theft, there was restoration. For every misuse, there was a story of God turning digital tools into vessels of provision. The internet as marketplace revealed humanity's hunger, not just for products, but for meaning. And in that hunger, a whisper echoed, "Man does not live by bread alone." By the mid-2020s, the internet was not only a marketplace, it had become a courtroom, a stage where justice was demanded, delivered, and sometimes distorted. Voices for equality rose first. Movements that once would have been whispers in small circles became global roars. Hashtags ignited protests. Videos recorded on shaky phones exposed abuses once hidden in silence. A young woman in Minneapolis recalled filming an encounter on her phone and uploading it. Within hours, millions saw it. Within days, protests filled streets across continents. "I was only one voice," she said, "but online it felt like the world spoke with me." For centuries, power had silenced the weak. Now, the weak carried power in their pockets. But along with cries for justice came cries for vengeance. The same platforms that raised awareness also enabled digital mobs. One wrong word, one old photo, one misunderstood post could end a career, destroy a reputation, or leave someone branded forever. A teacher in London admitted, "A mistake I made 10 years ago resurfaced. Overnight, I became an enemy to strangers I had never met." He asked in despair, "If God forgives, why doesn't the internet? The internet had given humanity the ability to expose sin, but not the wisdom to balance justice with grace. And yet, miracles unfolded. During a flood in Bangladesh, online networks spread pleas for help. Donations poured in, volunteers mobilized, lives were saved. A villager said, "The waters rose, but so did mercy, through screens." Justice was not only about punishing wrongs, it was also about lifting the fallen, and the internet proved capable of both, sometimes in the same breath. But the darker side remained. Cancel culture blurred the line between accountability and cruelty. Some deserved to be called out for harm. Others became victims of misunderstanding. A college student in California said, "I lived in fear of saying the wrong thing online. It felt like one post could erase my future." Was this vigilance or a new kind of tyranny? The digital courtroom had no judge, no due process, no appeals. It had only crowds. Still, some used the same platforms to defend the accused. A priest in Ireland rallied support for a wrongly accused neighbor, posting evidence online. Within hours, strangers joined to clear his name. The same internet that condemned, he said, also redeemed. It was proof that even in chaos, truth could find its defenders. The internet as stage of justice revealed a deeper struggle. Humanity longed for fairness, but fairness without forgiveness turned into cruelty. Mercy without accountability turned into chaos. The balance, always fragile, reflected the balance of the soul. Perhaps that was the divine reminder hidden in the noise. True justice requires both truth and grace. One without the other destroys. Only together can they heal. As the decade deepened, people began to ask, do we want the internet to be our judge or only our witness? The answer was uncertain, but one truth remained. God's justice is perfect, and his mercy infinite. The internet could mirror human hunger for fairness, but it could never replace divine wisdom. And in that tension, humanity was left with a choice: to wield digital justice like a weapon, or like a light. By the mid-2020s, the internet had become more than a marketplace, more than a courtroom. It had become a mirror of the human soul, a kind of global conscience, where every fear, every dream, every cry for justice or whisper of prayer gathered together. Search engines recorded humanity's secrets. The sick typed their symptoms. The lonely typed, "Does anyone care about me?" The guilty typed, "Can God forgive me?" A priest in Italy said softly, "When I see what people search for, I don't see data. I see prayers. I see people confessing to the only place they believe won't judge them." The internet, for all its wires and screens, had become a confessional booth for billions. Hope echoed too. During disasters, hashtags carried prayers across borders. A child in Lebanon prayed online for food during a famine. Days later, aid groups arrived, citing his post. "God answered me through strangers," he said, clutching bread in his hands. In Japan, after an earthquake, thousands shared words of encouragement. Survivors said, "We felt the whole world carrying us." For the first time in history, humanity's collective heart could beat in unison, through screens. But the internet also exposed humanity's deepest fears. A counselor in the United States noticed her patients often whispered the same secret. They had first typed their darkest questions into a search bar. Am I worthless? Does God hate me? Would anyone miss me if I were gone? The internet remembered every plea, every question, every cry into the void. But unlike God, it could not answer with love. And yet, miracles happened. A teenager in Brazil, on the verge of ending his life, stumbled across a stranger's post describing the same struggle and the same survival. He reached out, received comfort, and chose life. "I thought nobody could hear me," he said, "but God had already planted someone's words ahead of me." It was as if the digital web carried not just information, but invisible threads of divine timing. The internet as global conscience revealed contradictions. It held lies, yet preserved truth. It carried cruelty, yet carried mercy. It exposed sin, yet spread forgiveness. A historian wrote, When future generations read the archives of the internet, they will not only see what we knew, they will see who we were. And perhaps that was its purpose, not to replace conscience, but to reflect it, to force humanity to look at itself in a mirror too clear to ignore. In this mirror, the divine question lingered. Would humanity see only its brokenness, or also the grace that pulsed beneath it? The internet boom was not just the story of machines, it was the story of humanity's soul, stretched across wires, tested, revealed, and perhaps guided by a hand greater than our own. By the 2020s, the internet no longer felt like an invention. It felt like destiny. For centuries, humanity dreamed of connection. Ancient traders carved roads across deserts, sailors mapped oceans, telegraphs tapped across wires, radios carried voices through air. Every step, every invention whispered the same truth. We were meant to reach one another. The internet was not the first bridge, it was the grandest. A philosopher in India reflected, "Perhaps God has always nudged us toward connection. Each age built a rope, stone, ship, signal, and now the digital. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence." Destiny revealed itself in the smallest moments. A girl in Ghana uploaded a painting she had made from scraps of charcoal. A teacher in Canada saw it, shared it, and within weeks, the girl received supplies, sponsorship, and hope for an education. "I prayed God would notice me," she said. He did, through the eyes of strangers. Was it chance or divine choreography that a child's prayer in one continent echoed in another? Destiny also revealed itself in crises. When wildfires ravaged Australia, satellite images and social media carried warnings that saved entire towns. One firefighter said, "Without the internet, we would have been blind. With it, we were guided." When earthquakes struck Turkey, survivors posted pleas for help pinned under rubble. Rescuers found them by tracing the digital cries. "The internet was our lifeline," one survivor said. In those moments, the web of wires looked less like man's creation and more like God's net, catching souls before they slipped away. But destiny is not only light, it tests. The same platforms that saved lives also spread hatred. The same tools that connected also divided. A world that could speak as one voice sometimes chose to shout in chaos. A sociologist remarked, "The internet is humanity accelerated. It does not change who we are, it reveals it faster." And that too may be divine design. Not to give humanity perfection, but to hold a mirror so it cannot ignore its flaws. The question of destiny deepened. Did God give humanity this gift to prepare for a larger calling? Perhaps a world where nations could no longer isolate, where truth could no longer hide, where mercy could cross every border in seconds? Or was it a warning that if humanity could not handle connection, it would collapse under the weight of its own pride? The internet did not answer these questions. It asked them louder. And in its asking, a strange peace lingered. Because beneath the chaos, there were threads too perfect to ignore. A song in Italy lifting hearts in Brazil, a prayer in Africa answered by strangers in Europe, a child in Asia taught by a teacher across the ocean. Patterns like these did not feel like coincidence. They felt like orchestration. Perhaps the internet was not man's greatest creation, but God's reminder that humanity was always one family, scattered but destined to find its way back together. The internet boom was more than wires and code. It was the unfolding of a design larger than any one company, nation, or generation. And destiny, as always, carried both blessing and warning. The gift was real. The test was ongoing, and the outcome was still being written, click by click, soul by soul. The internet had grown from whispers in basements to the bloodstream of the world. It carried laughter, lies, prayers, cruelty, miracles, and despair. It had become a stage, a marketplace, a courtroom, and a memory. But above all, it had become a question. What would humanity do with this gift? For every story of mercy, there was one of malice. For every miracle, there was manipulation. For every soul lifted, Another was wounded. The internet reflected not only connection, but choice. A pastor in Kenya said, "The internet is like fire. Fire cooks our meals, warms our homes, and gives light. But fire also burns, destroys, and kills. The difference is how we use it." And so, the divine pattern was clear. God had allowed humanity to touch something powerful, but he had also given freedom. The internet was not destiny alone. It was responsibility. The lessons unfolded in countless lives. A businessman in London confessed that online greed had ruined him, but the same internet later gave him a second chance to rebuild with honesty. It was as if God let me fall, only so I would learn to walk again with integrity, he said. A young girl in Brazil, once tormented by cyberbullying, later found strength in an online community of survivors. Years later, she became an advocate, teaching others to protect themselves. "God turned my wounds into weapons of hope," she said. The internet was not only a place of sin, it was also a place of redemption. The moral dilemmas remained. Should children be given freedom online or protection? Should speech be unrestricted or guided? Should truth be curated or left to fight alone? A scholar in Canada asked, "Is the internet our greatest achievement or our greatest temptation?" The answer was not simple, because the internet was not just invention, it was reflection, and reflection is not always comfortable. But perhaps that was the point. God had never promised humanity comfort without challenge. He had promised meaning through trial, purpose through struggle, mercy after failure. The internet was not an escape from those truths. It was an amplifier of them. Every time a message of hate went viral, so did a story of kindness. Every time a scam hurt the weak, a miracle of generosity rose somewhere else. Every time pride collapsed, humility bloomed. The internet's contradictions were not signs of chaos. They were reminders of the oldest truth. Humanity is always torn between selfishness and grace. And so the question lingered, heavier than ever: would humanity allow the internet to become a monument to pride or a testimony of compassion? Would it be the Tower of Babel rebuilt or the Book of Acts revived? A place where every tongue, every nation shared in one spirit? The answer, perhaps, was still unwritten. But one thing was certain: the internet was not an accident. It carried the fingerprints of design, of a God who had always intended for his creation to be connected. The choice, as always, was left to humanity. The internet began as whispers in university halls, in blinking terminals and lonely modems. But in a single generation, it became the thread stitching humanity together. It carried prayers and curses, lies and revelations, cruelty and compassion. It connected not just machines, but souls. And perhaps that was always its purpose. When we look at the story of the internet boom, we see more than technology. We see humanity exposed. We see pride punished, generosity magnified, loneliness revealed, and mercy amplified. We see the fragile human heart trying to make sense of a power it could barely control. But through it all, a divine pattern shimmers. Connection was never an accident. From caravans on the Silk Road to the telegraph, to satellites, to fiber optics, humanity has always been pushed toward one another. The internet was not the beginning of that story. It was its loudest chapter. And the moral takeaways are clear. Connection is a gift, but also a test. Knowledge is power, but without wisdom, it becomes a trap. Memory is sacred, but without mercy, it becomes cruelty. Justice is holy, but without forgiveness, it becomes tyranny. The internet revealed these truths not as theories, but as living lessons, written in the lives of millions. A grandmother hearing her late husband's voice again. A child saved by a doctor across the ocean. A widow lifted by strangers' generosity. A prisoner redeemed by faith forums. A teenager spared from despair by words written years before he read them. These were not coincidences. These were threads of providence woven into the web of wires. And so, the story ends with the same question it began. What will we do with this gift? Will we use it to isolate, envy, and wound? Or will we use it to build, to heal, to lift, and to remind the world that beyond the wires, beyond the noise, beyond the screens, we are still one family under God? The internet is still being written. Its legacy will not be decided by corporations or algorithms alone, but by the quiet choices of billions of souls, by what you post, by what you share, by how you use your connection, not just to be seen, but to see others. Perhaps in the end, the internet is not just man's invention at all. Perhaps it is God's reminder, gentle, insistent, that no one was ever meant to walk alone. Thank you for sitting with us tonight, here by the fireside. You are part of this story too. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.